Good evening, time traveler. To understand the medieval tavern, you must first discard the idealized images propagated by Hollywood films and fantasy RPG games. But first of all, subscribe to the channel, otherwise you'll have rats sleeping in your bed with you. The real medieval tavern was not merely a quaint gathering spot for jolly bards and noble knights. It was a smoky, sticky, and perilously dangerous institution where the line between civilization and chaos was as thin as watered-down beer. It was a place where survival required street smarts, where a wrong word could result in a knife between the ribs, and where the ale served was often the cleanest thing entering your body. Imagine trudging through the muddy, waste-strewn streets of 14th-century London. The rain has turned the road into a river of filth, and hunger gnaws at your soul. You spot a wooden sign creaking in the wind, perhaps a boar's head or a bunch of grapes, and you step through a heavy door. You have not just entered a building. You have entered a world with its own rules, a town hall, stock exchange, and employment office rolled into one chaotic entity. The first thing to greet a patron was not a friendly face, but an overwhelming olfactory assault. The air inside a medieval tavern was a complex bouquet of unwashed humanity, sour spilled ale, acrid smoke from poorly ventilated fires, and rotting organic matter. The floors were rarely wood. They were typically packed earth covered in rushes, long grasses meant to absorb spills. In theory, these were changed regularly. In practice, they formed a composting ecosystem of decomposing food, dog feces, and the occasional dead vermin, creating a spongy landscape that squelched beneath your boots. The walls, made of wattle and daub, were blackened by soot. The low ceilings, supported by ancient ship beams, hung heavy with dried herbs, onions, and meats that failed to mask the stench. Lighting was dim, provided by a roaring hearth that cast sinister shadows, or expensive tallow candles that added to the thick, breathable smog of the room. In this suffocating atmosphere, coughing and wheezing were the standard greeting. Not all drinking establishments were created equal. A traveler needed to understand the distinct hierarchy to avoid sleeping in a ditch. The inns. At the top were the inns, the aristocrats of hospitality designed for wealthy merchants and travelers. Establishments like Chaucer's Tabard Inn offered actual beds and meals. However, privacy was non-existent. Guests were packed into rooms, often sharing a single bed with strangers. These beds, rope frames with straw mattresses, were breeding grounds for lice and fleas. Sleeping required keeping one eye open to prevent theft by a bedmate. The taverns, the middle ground. Originally wine shops for the wealthy, they evolved to serve food and other drinks. Wine was an imported luxury from France or Spain, and fraud was rampant. Unscrupulous vintners would water down expensive vintages or create counterfeits. To combat this, wine criers inspected barrels, and savvy customers demanded to visit the cellar to verify the source of their drink. The alehouses. At the bottom were the humble alehouses, often run by women known as Alewives out of their private homes. Marked by a broomstick or branch above the door, these were the neighborhood hubs. The ale was inconsistent, sometimes nutritious, sometimes thickened with breadcrumbs or dubious herbs, but it was the lifeblood of the commoner. In the medieval world, alcohol was not a vice. It was a survival mechanism. Water sources like the River Thames were toxic cocktails of sewage and industrial waste. The brewing process, which involved boiling water, killed deadly pathogens, making ale and wine safer than water. Ale, the staple diet. Everyone from toddlers to the elderly drank it. Small beer, low alcohol, hydrated the workers, while stronger brews provided calories. It was a living product, thick, cloudy, and full of herbs like bog myrtle, before hops became common, which sometimes added mild psychoactive effects. Wine, a status symbol laden with religious significance. It was expensive and prone to spoiling during transport. Mead, cider, and perry. Regional specialties made from honey, apples, or pears, ranging from sweet treats to potent intoxicants. If the drink was a necessity, the food was a hazard. The centerpiece of the tavern menu was pottage, a perpetual stew simmering in a cauldron that was rarely cleaned. New ingredients, grains, vegetables, and meats of questionable origin, were simply thrown in to replace what was eaten. It was a microbiological nightmare, yet it provided a hot, filling meal for the urban poor. Meat was often tough, stringy, or on the verge of spoiling, heavily salted to mask the taste of rot. Bread varied from fine white loaves to dense gritty brown slabs used as edible plates, trenchers. Hygiene in the kitchen was non-existent. Raw meat and vegetables shared cutting boards, and rats were constant kitchen companions. Despite the dangers, the tavern meal was crucial for the nutrition of the working class, offering protein and calories they couldn't cook at home. The tavern was the great leveler of society, where distinct classes collided. Merchants, dressed in finery, they were walking targets for thieves. The smart ones traveled in groups. The desperate ones, on the verge of bankruptcy, were dangerous and unpredictable. Soldiers, veterans of foreign wars, brought PTSD and a casual relationship with violence. A tavern full of unemployed mercenaries was a powder keg. Pilgrims, often less holy than they appeared, many were using pilgrimage as an excuse for a vacation or to escape legal trouble. The clergy, despite church condemnations of taverns, priests and monks were regulars, often engaging in the very vices they preached against. Thieves and cutpurses, indistinguishable from honest travelers, they worked in teams to relieve patrons of their wealth through stealth or distraction. Gambling was the heartbeat of the tavern night. It wasn't just a game, it was an attempt to wrestle with fate. Dice, the game of hazard, an ancestor of craps, was the most popular. Cheating was an art form, with loaded dice and sleight of hand being common skills. Cards, as paper became cheaper, card games like Primero grew in popularity, bringing with them complex codes of cheating. Blood sports, in the yard, cockfighting and bear-baiting drew crowds betting on death and survival. Superstition ruled the gambling table. Players used lucky charms and rituals, believing God or the devil influenced the fall of the dice. Fortunes were won and lost in minutes, leading to debts that were often settled with steel rather than silver. Violence in the medieval tavern was not an anomaly, it was a feature. In a society governed by a rigid code of honor, a perceived slight could not go unanswered. With everyone carrying large utility knives for eating, escalation was lethal. Fights were brutal and practical. Gouging, biting, and stabbing were standard tactics. Improvised weapons, such as heavy pewter tankards, turned into skull-crushing bludgeons. The aftermath was grim. With primitive medical knowledge, a minor cut could lead to fatal infection, and broken bones were often life sentences of disability. The tavern keeper acted as an informal judge, often using a cudgel to enforce peace, but even he could not stop the cycle of revenge that often followed a tavern brawl. In the upstairs rooms and dark corners, prostitution was an open secret. While the church condemned it as a mortal sin, it practiced a pragmatic tolerance, viewing it as a necessary sewer to keep the rest of society clean. The women lived hard, dangerous lives. Some were independent, others were essentially enslaved by debt or coercion. They faced the constant threat of violence from drunk patrons, the risk of pregnancy which could end their careers, and the inevitability of sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, for which there was no cure. Yet, for many women in a society with few economic options, the tavern offered a precarious means of survival. Justice in the tavern was a messy overlap of royal law, church canon, and guild regulations. Constables were often part-time and easily bribed. A tavern keeper might pay protection money to officials to overlook gambling or after-hours drinking. The church was equally hypocritical, preaching against the tavern while owning the land on which it stood or collecting tithes from its profits. True justice was often tavern law, immediate, physical, and administered by the community or the keeper. A thief caught in the act might be beaten by the mob rather than dragged before a magistrate. As dawn broke, the tavern revealed the cost of the night. Bodies, drunk or dead, had to be moved. Broken furniture had to be repaired. The tavern keeper tallied his profits against the destruction. But for all its filth, danger, and corruption, the medieval tavern was the beating heart of its time. It was a place of radical human connection. It was where the strict hierarchies of feudalism briefly dissolved, allowing a peasant to gamble with a knight or a merchant to drink with a thief. It was a mirror reflecting the full spectrum of the human condition: our need for community, our escape into intoxication, our capacity for violence, and our desperate hope for a lucky break. The medieval tavern was not the romanticized setting of a fantasy novel. It was a gritty, sensory nightmare. Yet, it was undeniably alive. It survived because it met the fundamental needs of the human animal: food, drink, shelter, and the company of strangers in a dark, cold world. Its legacy endures today in every pub and bar where people gather to seek refuge from the storm outside, proving that while the floors may be cleaner and the beer less chunky, the human desire for the tavern remains unchanged. Good night.